But the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee is set to announce their latest decision on interest rates before all of that. On the cards could be the largest rate rise for over 30 years as the bank tries to curb inflation. The base rate is expected to increase by at least 0.5%, with some suggesting it could be raised by 0.75%. This, of course, a day before the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, prepares to spend potentially hundreds of billions of pounds on energy bills and to reduce revenues in tax cuts in his mini-budget tomorrow. It's been criticised by some as what has been described as trickle-down economics. But what does that mean? Is it a fair criticism? And what can we expect tomorrow? Let's get stuck right in. I'm joined by Jonathan Portes, the former chief economist at the Treasury, and Andrew Lilico, the executive director at Europe Economics. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Let's start with you, Jonathan. What do you expect the overarching strategy of the Chancellor to be tomorrow morning?
Well, I think it appears to be basically Reaganomics. That is to say, cut taxes, don't worry too much about spending, and assume that somehow at some point growth will help balance the budget. Whether that is a viable strategy at a time when interest rates and even more worryingly, UK gilt yields are rising quite sharply and the pound is falling, I think is questioned by me and a number of other observers. I think the point here is not so much the energy price package. That was in some sense politically inevitable. I think any government would have done much the same thing, to be honest, even though lots of economists like me don't much like it, but it was a necessity. But the idea that now that this is that permanent tax cuts, large permanent tax cuts with no prospect and no plan to put us on a fiscally sustainable path, as the IFS has just pointed out. The idea that that's a credible economic strategy seems rather questionable to me, and I think to many observers.
Well, let's put that to Andrew Lilico now. This idea that permanent tax cuts may not be the revenue raisers that the Chancellor perhaps expects, or at least that this is a bit of a gamble.
Well, I don't know why tax cuts would be any more permanent than spending rises. They don't want to raise taxes for now. The policy appears to me to be, apart from the energy package, and I probably share some of Jonathan's doubts about that, but also the political inevitability of it. Apart from the energy package, the tax measures which they're doing seem to me to be absolutely orthodox, ordinary kind of approach to macroeconomic policy making. You have a recession, you try to cut taxes or not to raise them as much in the face of the recession. For all Liz Truss's claims to be engaging in some kind of breaking of Treasury orthodoxy, that just seems to me a very conventional approach to things, and I'm not sure why it's discussed as being such a weird idea. In terms of what happens over the longer term, what she wants to do is to introduce various kinds of measures to make the economy grow faster. But the tax measures which she's introducing here aren't going to be the ones that do that. That's more about the various changes to planning rules or changes to the attractiveness of the UK as a location for new technologies or those kinds of things. It's a much broader agenda. The tax measures she's going to introduce aren't going to be ones that change the long-term growth rates of the economy by themselves.
Changes, really importantly, a little bit later in this conversation. But just to the question of whether or not this is conventional economics. Jonathan Portes, you described it as Reaganomics earlier. What do you say to Andrew Lilico's suggestion that cutting taxes at the time of recession is fairly conventional?
Well, I mean, letting the budget deficit widening and even taking discretionary measures temporary measures to let the budget deficit widen in the face of a recession is conventional. But of course, the energy price package does that and much, much more. This is in some sense a much larger fiscal loosening than we saw, say, in 2008-9, much, much larger. But it is not, I'm not quite sure where Andrew gets the idea that these aren't permanent cuts. If Liz Truss is saying that, say, the reversing the national insurance rise that she's planning to announce, that's only a temporary measure to stave off a recession, then I will admit that he's right and I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that's not what she's going to say. What the IFS and what every one who's looked at the numbers says is that the result of the large tax cuts, the changes, the reversing Sunak's rises in national insurance and corporate tax mean will be a large, very large budget deficit for the foreseeable future, with no plan whatsoever to return to a fiscally sustainable path. That's not about temporary measures during a recession to boost demand, where I think Andrew and I are broadly in agreement. It is saying we would like to, and remember, they are saying they'd like to balance the budget. They just have absolutely no plan for that. And that is not something that previous governments have done. And it certainly isn't, it is against the Treasury orthodoxy in the sense that for whatever you thought of them, Brown, Osborne, Hammond, etc., at least said, look, this is our plan. Here are the measures that broadly get us back towards a sustainable fiscal path. And this government is simply, as I said, adopting the Reaganomics thing of saying, well, we're going to cut taxes. And look, as I said yesterday, Reagan famously said, I'm not worried about the budget deficit. It's big enough to look after itself. And that's essentially the Kwarteng Trust's line as well.
Well, I suppose the answer to that might be that we haven't had a budget surplus for more than 2 decades under a variety of chancellors, some who've said they wanted to eliminate the budget deficit and some who have been less worried about it. None of them have succeeded. I suppose, Andrew Lilico, is this new approach, this idea that actually perhaps the deficit right now in the short term doesn't matter so much and that our debt burden is not as bad as some other comparable G7 countries. Is this a big change, and might it work?
Well, there's a few things going on here, I think. One is that there's considerable uncertainty about the outlook, both in terms of areas such as how much does the energy package, is it actually going to cost? That's very contingent upon what happens to gas prices. So it's very difficult, because it's very difficult to guess, even to within the many tens of billions, as to how much it might cost in the end. It's very difficult then to schedule any tax measures or other spending cuts that would balance that off, because you don't know what the target is that you're shooting at. Another thing is that the government is intending to introduce a set of measures. They haven't told us what they are, but they have this aspiration of raising the long-term growth rate of the economy, and it would be counterproductive potentially to at the same time as you're trying to introduce measures that make the economy grow faster, also to introduce a program that was based upon you failing to do that, of correcting the budget. But a third element here, which is quite different from those of the past couple of decades, is that we have high inflation. And the thing about high inflation is that, well, it's going to tend to erode your public spending levels by itself, but it's also going to erode your debt as a proportion of GDP. So it's a different kind of a situation that we face, and the correct fiscal principles to apply have to be flexible to the differences in the situation.
Interestingly, Liz Truss said last night that she does want to get the UK's growth up to 2.5%. That seems to be a very explicit target of this government. It's something that could fund further tax cuts or indeed higher public spending. Just as a final question to the both of you, Jonathan first, is it achievable?
It's going to be very difficult. Remember, Gordon Brown did almost exactly the same thing, and that didn't work out too well. It's not hard. It's certainly achievable to set a target. Actually achieving it is quite a different matter. And it will require action on a number of fronts. It will require increased public and private investment. It will require action on education, training. It will require improving physical and digital connectivity. It will require building more houses and some changes to the planning system. Remember, all of those things I've said have been well known, and indeed various governments have tried to do them over the past 20 years, and sad to say, largely failed. So I think setting this as an aspiration and saying that you're going to set policy to try and get there is perfectly reasonable, as I said, far from unusual. making your spending and tax decisions on that basis, I think, is at best a bit of a gamble.
And in 30 seconds, if you would, same question to you, Andrew Lilico.
I think it's reasonable to aspire that we should get the level of annual GDP growth back to what was typical from the period of the early 1980s until the late 2000s. I think that we've got ourselves in a kind of, we got ourselves stuck in a rut, and that it's reasonable to think that we might get ourselves out of that. In fact, the period of high inflation will do a little bit of that for us by itself, and other international developments may also help. So it could actually be that Truss ends up looking quite good on this, even though the things she specifically didn't make that much difference.
Really, really interesting stuff there. Well, thank you both to Jonathan Portes and Andrew Lilico for that detailed exploration of what's going on with the economic policy of this government. I suppose it's not long to wait to see what the Chancellor says tomorrow morning.